Mrs. Toggle's Class Picture Day by Robin Pulver, illustrated by R.W. Alley. Mrs. Toggle's Class Picture Day, story by Robin Pulver, pictures by R.W. Alley. In loving memory of my dad who didn't have to worry about bad hair days, and for Ann Tindo, our best fixer-upper, R.P., for Robin with thanks, R.W.A. As soon as Mrs. Toggle's children walked into their classroom in the morning, they ran right back out. "Yikes!" yelled Joey. "What was that?" cried Caroline. The creature in their room came after them. "Children, it's me, your teacher, Mrs. Toggle. I'm having a bad hair day." The children lowered their hands from their faces. "It's Miss Toggle, all right," said Nina. "But we shouldn't stare," said Caroline. "Bad hair day?" said Joey. "It's more like a bad scare day." "I thought it was a nightmare day," agreed Nina. "Paul said it will be a nightmare if we can't review subtraction for our test." "Uh-oh," said Caroline. "It's school picture day." "That's right," said Miss Toggle. "I can't have my picture taken looking like this." "Maybe we can help," said Caroline. "It's worth a try," said Miss Toggle. The children used paper clips and rubber bands on Mrs. Toggle's hair. They patted and sprayed and taped. They glittered and glued. But when they were done, Mrs. Toggle's hair was still bad. The principal, Mr. Stickler, stepped in. "Miss Toggle, is that you?" He asked. "What was all the shouting about?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Stickler," said Mrs. Toggle. "The noise was my fault. I scared the children. I'm having a bad hair day." "I've never heard of such thing," said the principal. "But if your hair is being bad, you must bring it to my office for time out." "You come, too. I suppose your hair is attached to you." "We're attached to Miss Toggle, too," said Caroline. "We love our teacher even when she's scary." "Besides," said Paul, "we need to review subtraction for our test." So Mrs. Toggle's hair headed for the principal's office. Miss Toggle went along with it, and so did Mrs. Toggle's students. Mrs. Toggle sat down with her hair in the timeout chair. But Mrs. Toggle's hair didn't stop being bad. It didn't settle down one bit. "Oh dear," said Miss Toggle. "Now I'm having a bad chair day as well as a bad hair day." The custodian, Mr. Abel, walked in. "Mrs. Toggle," he said, "is that you? Your hair, it looks just, great." "There's no need to be polite, Mr. Abel," said Mrs. Toggle. "I'm having a bad hair day." "Hey, Mr. Abel," said Dina. "You can fix everything. Could you repair Mrs. Toggle's hair?" "Oh, yes, please," begged Paul, "so we can get busy reviewing subtraction for our test." "And so she'll look good for school pictures," said Nina. Mr. Abel scratched his head. "I use a blow dryer to fix my own hair, but there are no blow dryers at school. I'll try to think of something else. Meanwhile, Mrs. Toggle, why don't you go see the nurse? When I have a bad back, I take medicine. Maybe Mrs. Schott has medicine for bad hair." So Mr. Stickler gave Mrs. Toggle permission to take her hair to the nurse's office. "I'm glad I never have bad hair," he said. "You don't have much hair at all," declared Caroline. "It's been subtracted from your head," observed Paul. "That's right," said Mr. Stickler. "My head is perfect. Perfect heads don't need hair to cover them up." At the nurse's office, Mrs. Schott took one look at Mrs. Toggle and shrieked, "Mrs. Toggle, what bad hair you have!" "I know," said Mrs. Toggle. "We're hoping you have medicine for it." "To make it settle down," explained Nina. "Like Mr. Abel's bad back sometimes," added Dina. Mrs. Schott shook her head. "I have no medicine for bad hair, but just in case bad hair is catching, you better wear a mask." Mrs. Schott put a mask over Mrs. Toggle's mouth and nose to keep bad hair germs from spreading. "How can she teach subtraction with her mouth covered like that?" asked Paul. "I will look ridiculous for school pictures," muttered Mrs. Toggle. "It's the best I can do," said Mrs. Schott. "But why don't you go to the art room? Maybe Miss Doodle can help you." The art teacher, Miss Doodle, was hanging finger paintings up to dry. "Mrs. Toggle," explained Miss Doodle, "it's not your day for art, is it? And what in the world have you done to your hair?" "She's having a bad hair day," explained Nina. "We thought you could make her more beautiful for school pictures," said Dina. "This is great," explained Miss Doodle. "I will use my imagination. But, Mrs. Toggle, why are you wearing that ugly mask?" "So she won't spread bad hair germs," said Dina. "And if bad hair germs is catching—" "Oh," said Miss Doodle, "I can make the mask look better too." She painted polka dots on it. Then she said, "And now for my masterpiece." Miss Doodle fluttered and flipped and pushed and poofed. She added color here, color there, lots of color everywhere. "There," she said, "at last. Children, how did I do?" "Miss Doodle," said Nina, "we don't want to hurt your feelings, but—" "Our teacher's hair is still bad," said Caroline. "It's worse than ever," blurted out Joey. "Well," said Mrs. Doodle, "some people don't appreciate fine art when they see it." "Miss Toggle," suggested Dina, "let's take your hair to the library. Maybe it will settle down for a story." The children asked the librarian, Mr. Page, to read them a story. "A quiet story," explained Caroline. "It's good for calming down wild things." "Namely, Mrs. Toggle's hair," said Joey. "You've come to the right place," said Mr. Page. He chose a book and began to read. His voice was calm and quiet, soft and soothing. Soon Mrs. Toggle and her class were sprawled out on the floor, sound asleep. When they woke up, Mrs. Toggle's hair was smushed on one side and standing up on the other. Mrs. Toggle yawned. "You read that beautifully, Mr. Page, but my hair is still bad." "Uh-oh," said Caroline. "It's time for school pictures." Miss Toggle and her class headed for the auditorium. "Oh, where is Mr. Abel with that blow dryer?" asked Mrs. Toggle. "There he is," said Nina. "He doesn't have a blow dryer. He has a—" "fan!" shouted everybody. Suddenly, everybody's hair was bad, except for Mr. Stickler's. "Sorry, Mrs. Toggle," said Mr. Abel. "I guess that was too much air for your bad hair." "That's quite all right." A few weeks later, when the pictures were ready, Mrs. Schott took one look and shouted, "I was afraid bad hair was catching." Paul put his picture up on his refrigerator at home. "Who cares about bad hair?" he said. "At least I passed subtraction." Read by Adria, North Elementary School, Holt Summit, Missouri, January 2016.